Saint Patrick was enslaved at 16. What he did next will leave you speechless. There's a moment nobody talks about. Not in the parades, not in the church services, not in the documentaries. It happened after the escape, after the 200 miles on foot, after the ship and the crossing, and the long road back to Britain. After 6 years of slavery, Patrick finally walked through the door of his father's house. He was free, and something was completely wrong. He doesn't describe it in those words. He's too careful a writer for that, too formed by the kind of suffering that teaches you precision. But if you read the Confessio slowly, not for the theology, not for the history, just for the human being underneath the words, you can feel it. The man who came back to that house was not the boy who had been taken from it. Same face, same family, same Roman-British household with a deacon father and a grandfather who had been a priest. Same food on the table, probably. Same language, same everything on the outside, except him. And what do you do with that? What do you do when the life you spent 6 years dreaming about surviving to get back to feels, the moment you're standing inside it, like it belongs to someone who no longer exists? That question is where Patrick's real story begins. Not on the boat going to Ireland. On the morning he woke up in Britain, free, and realized that freedom had not solved the problem he was actually carrying. Most people think Patrick's story is about endurance, about surviving the unsurvivable, about a teenager who got taken from everything and came back stronger. And that's true, as far as it goes. But it doesn't go far enough. Because the survival isn't the point. The survival is just the setup. The real question Patrick's life is answering is this: when everything that told you who you were gets stripped away, what's left? And what do you do with it? That question is going to follow us through this entire piece. And the answer, when we finally get there, is going to reframe something you thought you already understood about your own life. But first, Britain in the late 4th century. Let's get inside the world Patrick was born into, because it matters more than most people realize. Patrick's family were Romano-British, Roman citizens living in Britain during the slow unraveling of Roman imperial control over the island. His father Calpurnius was a deacon and also a local official, a decurion, a civic administrator. His grandfather Potitus had been a priest. Christianity was in this family's professional life, which is actually a little complicated when you think about it. In the 4th century, after Constantine, being a church official was not purely a spiritual vocation. It carried civic weight, tax implications, social standing. Patrick grew up in a household where faith and function were probably mixed together in ways that made it hard to tell which was which. He says this himself in the Confessio. He says that before his capture, he did not yet know the true God. He's not being falsely modest. He's being precise. He knew the name. He knew the rituals. He knew what his father and grandfather did on Sundays. But there was no fire in it for him. It was furniture, not fuel. Sound like anyone you know? A lot of Americans right now are sitting in exactly that inheritance. Faith as furniture. Faith as cultural background. Faith as the thing your family did. The reason you have certain holidays circled on the calendar. The vague sense that there's something to it without being able to say what. You didn't reject it. You just never really inhabited it. And somewhere underneath the busyness and the noise, there's a question you haven't asked out loud yet. Whether what you inherited was real, and whether it has anything to do with the actual shape of your life. Patrick never asked that question voluntarily. It got asked for him, on a boat, in chains, in the dark. That's the thing about fire. You don't summon it. It finds the fuel it needs, and it takes. Hold on to that image. Fire is going to matter a lot before we're done here. When Irish raiders came to the western coast of Britain, and they came regularly in this period, the late 4th century, when Roman military protection was being stretched thin and then pulled back, they weren't primarily looking for religious targets. They were looking for people, slaves, labor. Patrick was 16, the son of a local official, almost certainly part of a group of people taken in a single raid. The Confessio mentions that thousands were taken with him. This was organized, industrial almost. The slave economy of early medieval Ireland ran on raids like this. He was taken to the northwest of Ireland, to a place most scholars identify as the area of County Mayo or County Antrim. There's actually debate about which mountain he served on, Slemish in the northeast or Croagh Patrick in the west. Either way, he was given to a man named Miliwick, set to tending sheep and pigs, and left to the silence. 6 years. Think about that number. You are 16 years old. You're someone's property. You speak enough Irish to receive commands, but not enough to build relationships. The landscape around you is nothing like the ordered, half-Romanized countryside you grew up in. There is no schedule, no community meal, no church calendar, no one checking on you. There is the mountain, the animals, the weather, and whatever is left of you after the crossing. What's left of a person after something like that? Patrick tells us. Not in abstract terms, in the specific language of a man who went through it and came out the other side still able to speak about it honestly. He says, prayer happened, not as a decision, not as a spiritual practice he chose to adopt. It happened to him the way breathing happens, because the alternative was to stop. 100 times a day, he writes, sometimes more at night. And this is the thing that I want you to really hear, because it's easy to read that number as religious performance, as the behavior of someone especially devout, someone different from you. It wasn't. It was desperation, finding a direction. It was a human being with nothing left to lose, discovering that the nothing left to lose place is actually where the listening starts. He wasn't praying because he was holy. He was praying because he was broken open. And this is where something starts to shift in Patrick's story that changes everything about what comes after. The boy who left Britain hadn't known the true God. His words, not mine. The man who came back had been in conversation with that God every day, in all weather, without a roof, without a ceremony, without anyone watching. 6 years of that. 6 years of a faith that had no audience, no reward, no social benefit. Just a man and whatever he kept reaching toward in the dark. That kind of faith is a different substance than the inherited kind. It burns differently. It holds differently. It doesn't depend on conditions staying right. And here's the question I want to leave open right now, because we'll come back to it at the end. What was Patrick actually becoming during those 6 years? Not just spiritually, strategically. What was being built in him without his knowledge, without his consent, in a place that had been designed to destroy him? Because when we answer that, we understand why what he did next wasn't just courageous, it was almost inevitable. The escape is almost too cinematic to believe, except that Patrick tells it plainly, without drama. A voice in a dream. Your ship is ready. He runs. 200 miles. He gets to a port he's never been to, finds a ship that's preparing to leave, is initially refused by the captain, then accepted. The ship crosses, spends 28 days traveling through wilderness. Scholars debate whether this was Britain or Gaul. The crew nearly starves, Patrick prays. Food appears in the form of a wild boar herd. The crew takes notice. He eventually makes it back to his family. And here we are, back at that door. Back at that moment when the free man stands in his father's house and something doesn't fit. Patrick was changed. The world he came back to hadn't moved. He had, and the distance between where he was and where the people around him were, comfortable, Roman Christian in the furniture sense, managing their civic responsibilities and their social calendars. That distance must have been disorienting in a way that's actually hard to put into words. Have you ever come back from something? Not a trip, something real, something that cost you, and found that the people you loved most were still having conversations that felt like they were from another lifetime? Not because anything was wrong with them, just because you were standing in a different place now, looking at everything through different glass? That's one of the loneliest feelings available to a human being. And it's not the loneliness of being without people. It's the loneliness of being changed in a way that can't be fully explained to people who weren't there. Patrick sat with that. He trained. He was eventually ordained, though the path was contested, and there's a whole history of church politics around his mission that we need to get into, because it's more honest and more interesting than the sanitized version. But before any of that, there were the dreams. The second great dream of Patrick's life comes after he's back in Britain. A man named Victoricus arrives in his sleep, carrying letters from Ireland. One of them is for Patrick. He begins to read and hears the voices of the Irish people, the people who enslaved him, calling out, "Come and walk among us again." Again. That word. Not come for the first time. Again. As if the 6 years of captivity had established a connection that was now pulling in the other direction. And Patrick wept. He says so directly, not from fear, not from reluctance alone. He wept because the call was real, and he knew it was real, and he knew what it was going to cost. Here's something worth sitting with. The Irish people in that dream didn't call him by his Roman name. They called him Holy Boy. The people who had bought and sold him were, in his dream, calling him holy. The same landscape that had been a prison was now calling him home. Not his first home, a truer one. What does that tell you about the relationship between suffering and identity? What does it tell you about the possibility that the place that breaks you might also be the place that actually knows you? I'm not romanticizing slavery. Patrick didn't either. He called it a punishment in the same breath he called it a gift. And that tension, both things true at the same time, is the most honest theological statement in the entire Confessio. He never pretended it was fine. He never reframed it into something clean. He held the darkness and the grace together without resolving the tension, because that tension was the truth. Most of us have been taught that healing means the wound goes away. Patrick's entire life is an argument against that definition. Now, I mentioned that the path to his mission was contested. Let me tell you about that. Because this part of Patrick's story is the one that speaks most directly to people who have been told, at some critical moment, that they don't have what it takes. When Patrick's name was put forward to go to Ireland as a bishop, there was resistance. He was not the church's first choice. He was Romano-British, not Gaulish, not from the centers of theological power in the late 4th century. He lacked the formal Latin education of the church leaders who were evaluating him. And then, and this is the part he writes about with the most visible pain in the entire document, a close friend betrayed him. This was someone Patrick had confided in decades earlier. A man he trusted. Patrick had told him, in private, about a sin he had committed as an adolescent, before his capture, before any of his spiritual formation had happened. A youthful failure he carried with him. And when Patrick's detractors needed ammunition, when they were building a case for why he should be passed over, why someone more polished and theologically credentialed should go to Ireland instead, this friend went to them, handed them the secret, used it. Patrick was probably 60 when he wrote about it. The wound was still there in the words. Not rage, something quieter than rage. The specific grief of discovering that someone you loved thought so little of you that they would trade your confidence for their own convenience. He wrote the Confessio partly in response to this, not to defend himself with argument, to tell the truth, to put his actual story on record in his own voice, unfiltered, before other people's versions of him became the only versions that survived. He says explicitly, "I am not going to be silent about the grace that was given to me in the land of my captivity." That sentence, read it slowly. He doesn't say, "I am not going to be silent about what I accomplished." He says, "I am not going to be silent about the grace that was given to me in the worst place I ever was." That is the whole theology in one line. Not his achievement, not his courage. The grace, the thing that found him when he was not looking for it, in a place he didn't choose, in conditions that were not his fault. The grace that preceded everything. The grace that made everything else possible. Patrick's mission in Ireland lasted, depending on which historical reconstruction you follow, somewhere between 20 and 30 years. He operated primarily in the west and north of the island, areas that later tradition associates closely with his ministry. He baptized thousands, ordained local men and women into ministry, established communities, wrote letters, defended converts who were attacked, publicly confronted a British warlord named Caroticus, who had raided Ireland and murdered and enslaved newly baptized Christians. That letter, the Epistola, is the other document we have in Patrick's own hand, and it is incandescent with fury. The same man who wrote with such personal vulnerability in the Confessio wrote to Caroticus in a white-hot rage that reads, even across 16 centuries, like someone who has been pushed past the point of careful language. He was not a gentle saint. He was a whole person. And the range of him, from the raw vulnerability of the Confessio to the righteous fury of the Epistola, tells you something important about what authentic faith actually looks like. It doesn't flatten you. It doesn't make you smooth and mild and permanently at peace. It makes you more fully whatever you actually are, more capable of love, more capable of outrage, more present to the full spectrum of what's happening. Patrick felt everything, and he kept going anyway. Now here's something I want to bring in that most people never connect to Patrick's story because it's theological and it sounds academic, but it's actually the key to understanding why the Celtic Christianity he helped establish was so distinctive, and why it still resonates for people today who have given up on more institutional versions of faith. During Patrick's lifetime, one of the most significant theological controversies in Western Christianity was raging around a British monk named Pelagius. Pelagius taught, roughly, that human beings had the natural capacity to choose good, that grace was a kind of assistance to that natural capacity rather than its source. Rome, and Augustine in particular, pushed back hard. The Council of Carthage condemned Pelagian teaching in 418. Human beings could not, on their own, choose their way to God. Grace was not a supplement to human effort. It was the whole engine. Patrick never mentions Pelagius by name in his writings, but every line of the Confessio is an embodied argument on Augustine's side. Patrick did not find God. He was found. He did not choose his way into prayer. He was driven there by desperation. The grace that reached him on that mountain in Ireland was not a reward for effort or moral quality. It was given to a scared, lax, nominally Christian teenager who, by his own account, had done nothing to deserve it. He knew this. It was the foundation of everything. And this matters for you, right now, in whatever place you're actually in. Because the Pelagian idea, the idea that spiritual transformation is primarily a project of self-improvement, a matter of trying hard enough, choosing better, getting your act together, is everywhere in modern American life. It's in the self-help section. It's in the prosperity gospel. It's in the idea that if you're not where you want to be spiritually, it's because you haven't committed enough, haven't disciplined yourself enough, haven't wanted it badly enough. Patrick's entire life is a counter-argument. He was not the most qualified. He was not the most educated. He was not the most polished or the most connected or the most theologically sophisticated. He was the most available. He had been emptied out thoroughly enough, in a place remote enough from every form of human approval, that there was space for something real to move in. Availability, not achievement. That's the engine. And this connects to the fire. The Celts had a theology of fire that is different from how most Western Christians think about it. Fire in the Celtic tradition is not just a metaphor for passion or enthusiasm. It's a symbol of presence, divine presence specifically. The fire that cannot be owned but can be tended. The fire that needs to be fed or it dies. The fire that gives light and warmth and can also consume everything indiscriminately if you stop paying attention to it. Patrick's famous challenge at the Hill of Slain, where he lit a paschal fire on the night before Easter that was visible from the Hill of Tara, where the High King had forbidden any other fire to be lit until his own ceremonial flame was kindled, is told as a dramatic confrontation between Patrick and pagan power. And on one level it is. But on a deeper level, it's a statement about fire itself, about who has the authority to light it, about what it means to carry a flame into a place that didn't ask for it and doesn't want it, and yet cannot look away from it. That fire on Slain was seen from miles away. The king sent people to put it out. It wasn't put out. And Patrick, when challenged, didn't argue about theology. He prayed. Out loud. Right there. And the Confessio and later tradition both record that what followed changed the conversation entirely. There's a version of courage that announces itself. That makes speeches. That confronts power with better arguments and stronger data. And then there's the kind of courage that just keeps the fire burning and lets the fire speak for itself. Patrick was the second kind. This is where I want to come back to the question I left open earlier. What was Patrick actually becoming during those 6 years on the mountain? What was being built in him that made what happened next almost inevitable? Here it is. He was becoming someone who had no performance left in him. 6 years with no audience will do that. 6 years of praying to a God who could not be impressed by your vocabulary or your social standing, or your Roman citizenship, or your family connections. 6 years of weather and animals and silence and the slow discovery that the things you thought were you, your status, your name, your future, your plans, were not, in fact, you. They were things you had, and things can be taken. What can't be taken is the thing that remains when everything else has been removed. Patrick discovered that thing on the mountain. He didn't have a name for it yet, not the theological name, but he knew what it felt like. It felt like the only fire left in the cold. It felt like the one thing that was still standing when everything the world had said about who he was had been stripped away. And when he went back to Ireland, when he crossed that water again, this time voluntarily, this time with a mission burning in him that had been built from his own biography rather than handed to him by a church institution. He wasn't going back as a conqueror. He was going back as someone who had been reduced to the essential and found the essential to be enough. That's what speechless actually means in the title. It's not a reaction to a dramatic event. It's what happens when someone encounters a truth that they don't have existing words for. When the category they've been using doesn't fit the thing they're looking at anymore. Patrick being enslaved at 16 is a fact. A terrible fact. Something no one should have to survive. But what he did next, and I mean not just the going back, not just the mission, but the interior architecture of the man who was capable of all of it. That's the speechless part. He let the worst thing that ever happened to him become the most load-bearing thing in his life. Not by deciding it was secretly fine, not by pretending it didn't cost him everything, but by refusing. And this is a choice. It is always a choice. By refusing to let the breaking be the final word about what he was. He wrote, near the end of the Confessio, that he was a simple countryman, unlearned, the least of all the faithful, held in contempt by many. He wrote this as a man in his 60s who had built something that would outlast the Roman Empire. He wrote it without irony. He believed it, and somehow that belief, that genuine sense of being small, of being carried rather than self-propelled, was the thing that kept him honest enough, present enough, available enough to keep being used. Small people who know they're being carried go further than large people who think they're walking on their own. That's not a spiritual platitude. That's the lesson from a specific human life that we can trace in his own handwriting. The Irish didn't forget him. 16 centuries later, on the island he went back to, his name is everywhere. Not because he had superior credentials, not because he was politically connected, because he came back, because he crossed the water twice, once in chains, once in love. And the second crossing is the one that changed everything. You've probably crossed some water in your life that you don't talk about. The kind that took something from you that you didn't give voluntarily. The kind that left you standing at a door that should have felt like home, and noticing, with a cold clarity, that you had become someone that door didn't quite fit anymore. Patrick's life doesn't promise you that the water gets easier. It promises you that the crossing has a direction, that what you lose in the passage is not always the part of you that matters most, and that sometimes the voice that says, "Go back," is not a punishment. Sometimes it's the thing you've actually been being prepared for the whole time. The fire on the hill of slain is still burning. It never went out. The question isn't whether you can see it from where you are. The question is whether you're willing to light your own. Lord, I'll be straight with you. There have been moments I thought the taking was the whole story, that what was stripped from me was proof of something, of my smallness, my unworthiness, the gap between who I said I was and what I actually had to offer. I've sat in that story longer than I should have. Today, I'm asking for what Patrick found on the mountain, not the freedom from suffering, just the clarity inside it. Teach me what I'm becoming in the hard place, because if all of this is load-bearing, I want to carry it right. Show me the crossing. I'll take it from there. Amen.